Well, thank you everybody for coming. I have kind of a full presentation here. I'm going to be presenting on this at a conference, so if you guys will indulge me to go through the slides a little bit here, then I can get can kind of do the full deal. And I'm assuming also that not everyone here was able to look at the paper in advance, so I've got some of it that's contextualizing my paper in terms of my broader research, and then I'm going to kind of walk through a skeleton, bare bones of the actual paper itself. So my name is Nicholas Miser. I'm from the anthropology department, and this is for my dissertation research. The title of this talk is "One Must Walk into Mordor: The Role of the Contingent, Mundane, and Silly in Mythologizing Through Role-Playing Games." So an overview of my research. I'm looking at tabletop role-playing games as opposed to video games like World of Warcraft or other online role-playing games, specifically tabletop, where people are sitting around a table together and having face-to-face interaction. And the three main questions for my overall research topic are: what is the relationship between narrative, rules, and play in role-playing games? How has this changed over time? We just hit the 40-year anniversary of D&D a few weeks ago, and a lot has changed over time over what people are assuming those relationships are and can be and should be. And then lastly, what does it suggest about the role of role-playing games in the broader culture, both in terms of what things from the broader culture are we seeing kind of in microcosm in gaming communities, and by looking at gaming as a performance, what can we learn about broader trends in culture? The way I've been going at that is through multi-sided ethnography. So for about 4 years, I've been going to 2 different gaming conventions, and I'll show you the location on the map in a second. And then I've followed people I met at those conventions back to their homes and their home gaming groups, and kind of done interviews throughout their social networks. And I hope to do 1 to 3 more sites, depending on how my budget is working out once I calculate. I just got back from a trip last week, so those sites are here. The 2 icons that are not dice are the 2 conventions that I've been going to. The red dice are places that I have been already, and then the 3 blacks are the places that I hope to be able to go in the next couple of months here. So what I've been doing at each of these sites is participant observation. As an anthropologist, I'm there taking notes, just writing down everything I can see, and then participating in actually playing through games and just kind of taking part of the whole experience. Been doing a lot of interviews, recording entire game sessions and trying to transcribe those. And then one of the main things I'm trying to do in my research is collaborative analysis with my interlocutors. So rather than just doing an interview and walking away and kind of taking what they say and spinning it completely on my own, trying to continue communication with them throughout the process and continue to bounce ideas as I'm trying to interpret what they're telling me. And that's been a very productive thing so far. So that's my broader research. I'm about halfway through my fieldwork season right now. I've got a few more trips and a lot of transcription to go before I can get to the dissertation phase. But this is some of the stuff that I've been working on. Starting by looking at narrative and the mythic. What I mean when I say mythic here, it's kind of a different definition. I'm still kind of toying with terms that I mean. Transcendent might be a better term, actually. I'm talking about the dimension of experience in which life is perceived in terms of its widest significance and meaning. And coming from a very kind of phenomenological approach, trying to look at how we experience story in our lives. And so what I find is when we look at our everyday lives, it's not always easy to find those mythic dimensions in everyday experiences. There are all sorts of events that happen to us that don't fit into the plots that we understand our lives to be a part of. And I have this quote from William James here I think captures some of that. It says, "The world is full of partial stories that run parallel to one another, beginning and ending at odd times. They mutually interlace and interfere at points, but we cannot unify them completely in our minds." And so to expand on that, looking at the differences between everyday life and conventional narrative, by which I mean sort of an author writing a book or someone writing a screenplay, and then an argument that role-playing games kind of fall in the middle between those 2. So in everyday life, we experience obscure, complex chains of cause and effect. We don't often know why things are happening around us, and it's a difficult thing to tease out, both on macro levels from socioeconomic things and political events, down to micro events in our everyday lives. We don't always know why things are happening, and these changes of cause and effect are complicated. There are no absolute endings that we experience in life. We will experience one absolute ending when we die, but no other threads in our life will ever wrap up. And if we look around in our experience, we see that when other people die, the stories that they're a part of continue on past them. And so there's this sense in which everyday experience is just an ongoing narrative that doesn't have absolute ending. There are also, of course, spatio-temporal constraints on our experience that limit our ability to mythologize those events that we experience by not being able to understand multiple perspectives in the way that we might need to fully understand something. And connected with that is limited intersubjectivity. We can share the emotions and thoughts of others, but that's always limited. The sharing is always partial. And so that controls our ability to make sense of reality. And then, of course, we have limited control over it. We can shape the events around us, but that ability to shape is very limited in the sense that I can't cause my hand to pass through this wood. I can't make things outside of my control just shape to my desires. On the other hand, in conventional narrative, you tend to have understandable chains of cause and effect. If an author includes lots of inane details that don't seem to tie into the chains of cause and effect in the story, we usually judge them poorly. We have narrative conclusions. In some ways, the most unrealistic thing that we ever see happen in the story is that it comes to an end and we close the book because of that not happening in everyday life, that nice, neat closure in which the story is done and nothing else will happen in that narrative universe. We have insight into multiple simultaneous events and consciousnesses. We can see all sides of an event that are happening, and we can see the thoughts of the people that are undergoing that, and that helps us to make sense of the events in the story in terms of broader significances. And the author has near complete control over the reality that they write. Nothing happens in the story that the author doesn't cause to happen, and so they can control every detail and create things like nice, neat plot arcs that we don't often see in our everyday lives. And I'm arguing that role-playing games are kind of in the middle here. And unfortunately, I don't have time to give a kind of a description of how role-playing games work. It is in the paper, but I'm going to have to breeze through that and just kind of tell you some of the effects of what I see from gaming. And so, but to jump to sort of the proto-gaming of something that happened that led into Dungeons & Dragons. In the bottom here, I have a picture of Clark Ashton Smith, H.P. Lovecraft, and Robert E. Howard, were kind of the three greats of American pulp fantasy from the early 20th century. And one of the things that you see in their literature is that they're creating a shared world together, and they kind of thought of it as a game where one of them would create certain fictional events and then the other people would use those events. And so by doing that and turning it into sort of a game-like process, they're ceding some of that complete authorial control over the universe they've created and making it a little bit closer to everyday life in the sense that things happen that are outside of their control and they have to respond to them. So we see that taken to a next level in role-playing games where not only are other people determining what happens inside the fictional universe besides the single author, but we introduce chance through the rolling of dice and probabilities that people can't always determine the outcome in advance. And there's lots of rules that constrain the things that can be attempted in shaping that reality. So you have a partial control over reality in the sense that you can determine what your character is going to do, and you might have a better sense of what's going to happen than in everyday life because you've got those formalized statistics, but it's still only kind of an in-between level of control. You have heightened intersubjectivity in the sense that you're getting in the minds of characters that you're playing and taking on roles, and people often describe a sense of heightened connection with the people that they're playing with too because of that connection through kind of a liminal performance environment. And we do have some kind of endings in role-playing games. Each session will draw to an end, but there's always the promise in most role-playing games that theoretically that story could continue on forever if you just keep coming back and playing more sessions. So it has a little bit of both sides of that. And then we have streamlined chains of cause and effect, where most things are understandable in terms of literary cause and effect, but there's lots of, because of the introduction of those chance details and other people, it's still a little bit more complicated trying to figure out what's going on. And so this helps to, I think, lay bare the process of narrativization a little bit, and so that causing players to reflect on that experience of making sense out of the details that happen. And you can see this Tolkien quote here, which is quoted in Michael Saylor's book. It says, "Uncorrupted enchantment does not seek delusion, not bewitchment and domination. It seeks shared enrichment, partners in making and delight, not slaves." And Saylor's phrase of drawing on kind of a Weberian framework with the enchantment is delight without delusion, being kind of partial, allowing yourself to be enchanted, but never fully so, and I was reflecting on that process. So the three things that I'm looking at as three main avenues of re-enchantment that have been really poignant as I've been watching gaming in my research are the contingent, the mundane, and the silly. So when I talk about contingency, what I mean is that there's a certain school of approach to gaming that's represented by my friend Tavis Allison, who's from New York, and you can see, this is me here, but this is Tavis at a gaming convention we were playing together. And his approach to gaming is informed by his understanding of old school gaming, which is a focus in my research of people who are trying to play the game as they understood it was played in the early days of the hobby in the 70s and 80s, because there were a lot of changes that happened. So he says, I don't have to have a grand plot, and that means that things are unpredictable that I figured out as it happened. So that means that as a dungeon master, when he's presenting the world to the players that are going to tell him what they want to do in that world, he doesn't necessarily have an idea of the narrative in advance. And when I watch him run a game, he's determining a lot of that through random chance and improvisation, so that if the players ask what's beyond the next hill, he doesn't know the answer to that question until he rolls the dice and uses the table that he's created to tell him that there's a unicorn on the other side of the hill, and that another set of dice might tell him that that unicorn is actually very angry and is going to attack them. And so how to prepare for a game in which you don't even know what's over the next hill is very different, and you have to make sense of those details as they emerge and create sort of an emergent story. Another old school gamer named James Malashewski, who I've not worked with, but is a prolific blogger, and he's jokingly called the Pope of the old school Renaissance. He says that like oracles of old, dice aren't prophets, they're invitations to look at the world in a different way. So there's a sense that in which, by learning to interpret those random events through gaming, that you start to see the world in a different way and start to find potential enchantment in seizing seemingly random events. The second thing would be mundanity, which I'm calling making strange with boring things. One of the rules in the early versions of Dungeons & Dragons that people tend not to pay much attention to in more recent circles, and it's always been an optional thing, is encumbrance. And you can see in this illustration here, this is where they're introducing those rules in the book. It's labeled as optional. This is a quantified rule set that tells you how much everything in the game world weighs and exactly how much that character can carry. As you can imagine, it's very cumbersome to deal with all of these details, and it's like actuarial science. And so a lot of people will want to jettison that because it kind of disrupts their immersion in the narrative environment. You have to step outside of thinking about the exciting things that are happening and start doing some math in addition and thinking about the rules. And I think that one of the things you can see when people are embracing that, because there are gamers that do that, is it serves to, like I said, provide that delight without delusion, in a son of a Brechtian theater sense, where Brecht would have these things that he would intentionally do in the theater to make sure that people never forgot that they were just watching a play. So keeping the house lights up and making the mechanisms of enchantment very visible. So by pulling people out of the narrative universe to calculate tabulations of rules and weights and measures, then these sort of mundane details in gaming can serve to provide ways of not only enchanting and thinking about those mundane details as potentially interesting narratively, but also constantly reminding them that what they're doing is a process of making sense out of mundane details and things that are difficult to narrativize in everyday life. The last thing is silliness, mythologizing absurdities. So you can see the image here, it kind of summarizes quite well. A lot of people, when they set out to play D&D, their goal is to play something in the sort of epic fantasy tradition of Tolkien. But because of all of those elements of chance and things outside of their control and potential failure, they often turn into something more like Monty Python. And some people might view this as a failure of the game to produce the sort of epic results that they wanted, and other people have gone on to make other games that might be better suited to produce that epic fantasy. But old school D&D is maybe not trying to do that. So rather than looking at it as a failed attempt to produce these high literary narratives, it might be a successful attempt at something else. And I think that part of what's going on there is that by embracing the contingent and mundane in these things, you're revealing some of the underlying silliness to those things in your own life and learning how to look at them in different ways. So Wittgenstein, with the quotation from him, he was actually a major fan of American pulp fiction because of the way that it didn't take itself too seriously, and therefore was able to approach the world and kind of think of it unconventionally in what he called the unpoliced ghettos of genre fiction, where no one really cared what you were doing, so you could do whatever you wanted and have fun with it. And I'd like to close by giving a story which kind of demonstrates some of these things. And this is from my own gaming experiences since I've been doing field work. And I call this the Legend of Radical Pizza. So about a year ago, actually, I was having a gaming event at my house, and I had a friend coming over, and he'd played with us before, but not in the current game we were having, so we had to make a new character. So I asked him, Dane, what do you think about what kind of character you want to have? Where might he be from? And he looked at me with a straight face and said, my character's name is Radical Pizza, and he lives in Party Town. Now, a year or two before that, before I'd been reflecting on these things, I'm like, Dane, Radical Pizza is not the type of names that we have in this world. You need to have something like Thalia or Arwen or some kind of cool fantasy name like that. And Party Town is not a place. I didn't write that into this game world. It's not there. But because I've been thinking about these things, I said, well, let's just roll with it. And so we created a place called Party Town, and the adventurers went there, and through a series of random events, by embracing some of the chance contingency rules that we built into the game, one of the characters found themselves in party jail, which we improvised, now existed in the middle of town as a kind of cell that you would see at like a Western fair or whatever, in the middle of town. These guards standing out front carrying pool noodles to keep them in there. And the way that I see the silliness playing in here is that the players, kind of embracing that silliness that we are embracing, thought this isn't really that serious of a thing. We're not going to approach this with the sort of standard fantasy trope of we're going to get our swords and fight the guards and do a little jailbreak routine. Instead, they decided, let's have a dance party, and that will distract the guards, and then we can just escape. And so I think of that in terms of, and reflecting on that experience, I think of the sort of way that just by chance and improvisation, we create a situation with someone stuck in an iron cage, and I'm like to think of with Weber a lot. So thinking of someone in an iron cage and how to get out of it becomes very poignant image for me. And so this idea that rather than directly fighting this sort of panoptic gaze of the guards, which is why I've got Sauron here as this sort of all-seeing eye, that by dancing their way out of the iron cage, that they are providing ways to resist and may find meaning in the middle of all of that, in spite of the controls and things put on them. And so that's where my title comes from, the idea that Boromir may be right in The Lord of the Rings when he said one does not simply walk into Mordor, but that maybe we can silly walk into Mordor. I don't think that modernity, the problems of modernity and post-modernity and super-modernity or whatever pronouns, prefixes you want to put on there are maybe as easily solved, but I think that there might be some lessons in there. Thank you.